Good morning, and thank you for letting me join your meetings. And I'm delighted to do this virtually. I'm only sorry that I can't be with you in person. My name is Barbara Bierer. I'm a professor of medicine at Harvard and faculty director of a center at Harvard and the Brigham and Women's Hospital called the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center. And really, I want to speak to you because I've been working on clinical trials all my life. And this window today, we're going to be talking about kids in research. And I want to make the plea to say, we really need you on our side to help us do this well. So today I'm going to cover a couple of different topics. One, who are we? What is the center? Very briefly. Then our project that's going on now called Promoting Global Clinical Research in Children. I want to review some of the tools for kids that we've developed and others, and then talk to you a little bit about what our issues are and to plead with you to help us. So with that, let me say that the MRCT Center based in Boston works on international clinical trials. We don't do anything that's only in one region or one country. Trying to help them be better and faster, and specifically for this group, responsive to the experience and needs of patients. Not, sort of the medical folks deciding what is good for the patients, but having patients participate in that work. And we do our work by pulling together all the relevant stakeholders for a project. That includes, of course, drug companies, academic sites and medical centers and doctors, but also, in this case, kids and parents, guardians, and then patient advocacy organizations, or the kinds of organizations like iCAN that help to bring the community together. And we've been doing now for a while a project specifically dedicated to pediatric research. So why do we need the project? Well, obviously, as you all know better than I, we need good treatments and approaches to problems of childhood. We believe that it's better to have research inform the way we treat and care for patients, including children and babies and teenagers, to make sure that what we offer is going to work in the age population and for the kinds of patients that we have. We also know that there are real global differences that make these trials very hard to accomplish. And those differences are both things like laws that are very different from one country to another as to what is allowable in research in children, but also things like what kind of healthcare is available, and therefore what the other options are for children who have certain diseases. So for instance, there are certain drugs that we can use in the US that go into the spine, directly into the sort of fluid around the brain. And that's the way they're delivered. That's fine when you have sterile conditions and all sorts of major hospitals here in the US, but it's not fine if you're in the middle of a community health center in Africa, for instance, where they may not have sterile conditions at all. And then there are also significant cultural differences as to what and who should be making the decision for children. Is it the parent? Is it the community leader? Is it dependent on the age of the child? Obviously, you can't ask a 1-year-old what they want to do, but some countries let 14-year-olds decide for themselves. Sometimes some countries say 18 years old, and some countries say kids should have a say in whether they participate, but not always should that say be definitive. Like sometimes kids don't want to get a shot, even if the shot is going to be life-saving. And the parents get to decide, even though we're interested in whether the kid wants to participate. And then there are a ton of process differences in how we do this research. So we started to look at this in terms of promoting clinical research in children with the aim to do it better, faster, and more respectfully. And what we're really here to talk today about is how can we do that well? And how can we do that respecting your input? And as investigators or researchers, how do I know if I've spoken to enough kids? I mean, in other words, if you ask one kid, can they speak for another kid? If you ask any one kid, can they speak for everyone? How many kids do you have to ask in order to know that you've gotten input from enough children? And how diverse does that group need to be? Do we need to go to various countries to find out what the opinions are? Do they differ that much? And I think personally, but I'd love to hear from you, that it probably depends on the question. If you say, a certain question like, do you look forward to a shot or an injection? Most kids worldwide would say no. But if you ask a much more challenging question than that, maybe the answers would be quite different. And then I'd say, the other big question is, how many different age groups in these different settings do we need to ask? Do we have an opinion from 7-year-olds? Is that different from 11 or 12-year-olds? Is that different than a 17-year-old? And how do we do this work well? So that's the sort of question that we'd like to address today. And I can say that we've also spent a significant amount of time developing tools for kids, often, sort of educating and talking to children who are going to be in research. The last thing that people do is take time out to explain it in ways that children can understand. So about, 6 or 8 years ago with Children's Hospital in Boston, we wrote a comic book just to explain what research is, because most kids younger than teenagers don't understand medical research. So we wrote a comic book that's available for everyone. It's only in English, but we think it's cute enough. And then when we get to an example like COVID-19, you can see that there's been a change in the way that we think about involving kids in educating them directly, and just taking a model for what iCAN did to create resources and sort of materials that from kids, by kids, about kids, and for kids to understand COVID-19, which is, our current international crisis. There are other resources. The WHO, the World Health Organization, developed a children's storybook that's adorable and very helpful for parents to read to their children so that they understand COVID-19. And then we worked on a health literacy project for COVID-19 at Harvard, developing fact sheets. And one of the things that we are particularly sensitive to is the fact that there really isn't languages other than in the US, generally English and sometimes Spanish, that are available. But we have lots of people that don't speak English or Spanish as their primary language. And similarly, there were challenges in terms of making these age appropriate. So what we've done in that health literacy project is have specific explanations for women who are pregnant, because obviously, they face different uncertainties and concerns and scares than others protecting their unborn child. Then we developed some resources for very young kids, 3 to 6 year old, and then 6 to 11 year old, and then adolescents and teenagers. So what did we change? Well, we changed the way that information was delivered. This is the one for 3 to 6-year-olds. And if you showed a picture of a duck to a 17-year-old, they'd find it rather childish, as it were. So we developed also a set of materials for 7 to 11 or 12-year-olds, and then ones that are for teenagers and young adults that have the same kind of information but presented very differently, and we hope in a way that is understandable. We've also done a job to translate these into 41 languages, and you can go to the website and get your language developed and see if it's useful. So none of those actually spoke about COVID-19 in research. They're all about the clinical condition of COVID-19, and research actually has some different aspects about it. So at the center, the MRCT Center, we developed what we think are kid-friendly, understandable information about COVID-19 in research. And we called it a "Should I Join?" In other words, what questions are there? Who should I talk to? What do I need to know? What are my rights as a potential participant? Do I have to volunteer? Can I decide not to? What's the role of my parent in all of this? And we made those generally available. They're part of a suite of "Should I Join?" research studies. And then we went on to think about sort of other issues that have never been really thought about for kids. For instance, at age, depending on the age of legal adulthood, often 18-year-olds, sometimes younger, sometimes older, you move from having assented potentially to being in a trial to having responsibility for the decision. But very rarely do we explain that. And those are general questions. So we wrote a brochure, as it were, about what it means to give consent versus what it meant to give assent. And these are the kinds of educational resources that we think would be helpful, that you could then go to a website and pull it down or see a video or whatever, and they're being developed, but not so often in research. So we need your help. This is more than education. We see it as a process. We see it important that the kids and their parents and loved ones have a chance to impact with us, with the researchers, about how we do our work. What questions do we ask? How do we conduct the trial? Who should be allowable in the trial? What do you think about the risks of some of the research? And I'll never forget a story when I was, used to see patients and kids, and I asked a kid whether he anticipated that the injection, what did he think about the risk of that in that experience? He looked at me and said, "It's not a risk, it's just going to hurt." And those kinds of moments really help us to understand how to explain things to kids. What are we putting them through? And sort of what risks did they want to assume for themselves? Then we have this issue of how do we get that information from people? As I said, this kind of question of representativeness. How are the older kids different than younger kids? How do we do that? Do we do it individually? Do we do it as a focus group? We've learned a lot from working with iCAN about what successful strategies look like. And then sort of fundamentally, how should we work with you, and how do you want us to work with you? How do we listen to you, hear you, and make sure that your voice is part of this process. So insofar as we can be helpful, we're available. Love to talk to you. I've given you my cell phone and my email, as well as the person who's working with me on this, and would love to engage in the future. And as life unfolds together. Someday, I'm sure we'll be able to be in a room together. And until that time, I hope you are well and stay well. My best, and thank you.